Welcome everyone back. It's been a good start already. I lucked out on this one. My job is just to introduce and then hand it over to our expert in the field of emotional intelligence, or as you'll probably hear him call it, emotional maturity. This morning we had CK kicked us off and he was talking about the human development models and the mission to be a teal organization. And as he talked about those human development models like spiral dynamics and Keegan's model, it might have started to become clearer just about the need for team leads to intentionally tune in to how they can support the evolution toward that mission and being a 100-year-old company. And teal includes self-management, evolutionary purpose, and wholeness. And wholeness includes understanding the role that emotions play. And I'm sure all team leads have had some experience with emotions at some point. So it's my pleasure to introduce our next presenter, Dr. Doug. He's most known for his groundbreaking work in developing the Bio-Emotive framework. I currently serves as a clinical psychologist when he's not providing emotional training programs that remove emotional barriers for leaders, individuals, and athletes. So Dr. Doug, thanks for being here.
Well, thank you, Tracy. I actually have to share that when Tracy told me that this was a company that actually talks about spiral dynamics, I got so excited. I actually taught integral theory with my wife here in Selkirk for I think 5 or 6 years. And we had a really nice community of people talking that language and learning about it. Most of them were parents of my kids who were just interested in this stuff because they heard their kids talking about it, because it started off as campfire conversations that we would have at our place. But it turned into a 5 or 6 year group that met, and we discussed all of Ken Wilber's integral theory. I actually have a whole section that if I had more time, I would have looked at the changing role of emotions in the different developmental stages and how that impacts on our communication. But that's probably a little bit too detailed for what we're going to go through, because this is an introduction to the emotional system. And part of why it's an introduction is because there's so many different ways of looking at the emotional system. And so, you know, I was an academic researcher for 10 years at the University of Manitoba, and I was studying the mind-body relationship. And it was really clear to me that, you know, as a scientific culture, we don't have a clear consensus on what emotions are. And in fact, we don't even differentiate between emotions and feelings in any coherent way. When I moved into becoming a clinical researcher, or a full-time clinical psychologist, that's when all of that theory kind of, the rubber hit the ground, so to speak. And I was really forced to deal with, like, what are emotions, what are feelings, because it was clear to me that most of the people coming in to see me, whether it was for depression or marital problems or anxiety, the key thing they had in common was that they didn't really know how to answer the question, how are you feeling? That was actually a very difficult question. And most people, if I were to tell you that you're probably suffering from something called cultural alexithymia, most of you would probably rebel against that. You know, because this is a leading edge organization and you guys are kind of into personal growth and self-actualization, I imagine. But if I ask someone how they're feeling, it's often I get a story with a lot of behavioral details, or I get discussions about what's going on in their body. But very seldom do I actually hear feelings. And so when I was, you know, I'd spent 10 years as a researcher. And when I started working with people, I was doing a very standardized intervention called Gendlin's focusing. Anyone recognize that word, Gendlin's focusing? No? It was a standardized intervention that this person used that really used the body to ground people into what their experience were. And Gendlin was a researcher who found he could predict who got better from therapy by how they responded to certain questions. And the response that he found, because he'd recorded all of these therapy sessions, was if he asked a question about, well, what happened between you and your husband? If the person went, well, it's kind of, if they paused and tuned into their system and then they started working at trying to articulate something, that was a leading edge that predicted that they were the most likely people to get better. The people who just started rattling off a story didn't get better. So he developed a technique to teach people how to do this. And I used that for the first 3 years of my practice. And I took it a little bit further in that I had people come to the core of their pain. And I'd say, find a word that resonates with the core of your pain. And as they got closer, they would tear up and maybe they'd start crying. And I knew I was getting to where I wanted. And I'd say, is this the essence of your pain? And if they said yes, we would stop there. And I'd write that word down. And if they didn't, we'd keep going until they found a word that felt to be the essence of their pain. Now, you guys have got my handout, so you kind of know the answer if you've looked at it. But after 3 years, guess how many words I had on my list for, you know, the essence of all of these different people's pains. You know, if you haven't looked at my worksheets, take a guess. How many words do you think are at the essence of the human experience for what people are crying about and in pain over? Just throw out some numbers.
12.
12, okay. Any others?
5.
5? Okay. That's getting close to emotions. By the end of my first year, I had 6 words. By the end of the second year, I had 8. And on the end of the third year, I had 9. And those 9, what I called core feelings, once I got those, everything else kind of started falling into place. Because all the words that were causing people to cry but weren't the essence, I looked at them and they were what I call interpersonal feelings. And these core feelings were what were actually causing the pain. So that discovery had me sort of develop what I've called the Bio-Emotive framework, and which has become kind of my agenda to teach, because for the most part, anyone who hears this framework and uses it goes, oh my God, why didn't I get this 20 years ago when I was in high school? Like, this just resonates and fits so well, and it works so well that it's got a lot of face validity. So that's kind of what I'm here to share with you. And once you get some of the other implications, it'll kind of unpack itself. I'm going to back up one step now to something that I started with, which is this idea of cultural alexithymia. So I'm going to share my screen. There. And you can all see that now? I imagine it takes a second to show up. Okay. So this is my emotional intelligence framework, and I prefer to call it emotional maturity, because that's really what I think is going on here. The word intelligence was kind of added onto it because Goleman came out of what you guys would recognize as a modern orange level of consciousness where everything's highly rational. And they kind of subsumed the emotional world into the intelligence world, the rational world. And you can sort of see by their attitude towards it as a way of becoming more functional and achievement oriented, that it's kind of been co-opted out of its natural domain. But that's a different kind of story. The theme that I want to just share is this notion of cultural alexithymia. And alexithymia is basically any impairment in the ability to experience, express, or resolve an emotional encounter. And as this was actually defined by Taylor from the University of Toronto, actually, he has a Toronto Alexithymia scale. About 15% of people have alexithymia, where they really have difficulty experiencing or expressing their emotions. But from my clinical practice, I got that number basically reversed, where I would say 85 to 95% of people have trouble with one of these aspects: experiencing, expressing, or resolving an emotional encounter. And our culture has been perpetuating this state of alexithymia for different reasons. So for anybody who's over, I'm going to stop this share. How many people grew up hearing words like, you want to cry? I'll give you something to cry about. I see some smiles. Do you want to raise your hands? You want to cry? I'll give you something to cry about. That's the perfect epitome of traditional blue or amber consciousness. Emotions got in the way of your functioning in the role you were supposed to take, which is what traditional amber consciousness is all about. When you move to modern, emotions get in the way of your achievement. You suppress them because they're overwhelming your rational mind and your ability to achieve goals. We've now moved in as a society to begin embracing postmodern values. And this is the first time in our developmental history where emotions and feelings are relevant. We actually raise our kids asking them how they feel. How many people have kids? And how many parents ask their kids how their kids feel? We all do it now. I was never asked how I felt as a kid. And most of us who were told, you want to cry, I'll give you something to cry about, you're explicitly told, I don't want you to feel anything. You just do what you're supposed to. So we now have a postmodern stage of development where we're embracing feelings and emotions and keeping the emotional system open, but we're not telling them how to actually experience and express and resolve those emotions. And so we've got the exact opposite problem. Instead of highly repressed, individuals who drink and do drugs to get, past all the repressive tendencies of their lives and let loose a little bit, we've got kids whose energies are flowing too strong and it's hard to contain. And this may be why we've got so much ADHD kinds of problems going on. But even without that speculation, kids don't necessarily get the language they need because as a culture, we don't know enough about emotions and feelings to help them. So what I'm going to give you is a basic overview of that process. But to do that, I'm going to share another little piece. We had people in the chat that were giving answers to questions there. So I like to talk about, so I say that most of our society's common mental health and communication and stress problems result from not fully actualizing the postmodern move, which is an embrace of emotions and feelings. Whether it's neurologically true or not, the Triune Brain model that MacLean put together in the 1970s is a very useful heuristic for understanding why being a human being is much more complicated than we think it should be. So how many people have heard of his model before, the Triune Brain? It's getting more and more popular as more and more people are trying to deal with some of these complicated dynamics. But I'll do a really short summary. He calls them different names, but it basically says because of our evolutionary history, we developed three different brain sets, and I probably should have gone in the opposite direction, so I'll put them all up. We have a physical brain, and it basically looks after our body and our basic survival: food, temperature, heart rate, digestion, sexual activity. The emotional brain is there to look after our relationships, and it works through impressions and associations, which we'll talk about more in the future. And this is why dogs and cats and mammals who have an emotional brain tend to be much more likely to become domesticated and be our pets than snakes and lizards and turtles, because snakes and lizards and turtles don't have emotional brains. If you've bonded with your turtle, there's a good chance it's a one-way relationship, that the turtle isn't thinking of you when you're not around. Okay? But a dog will bond with you and want to be close to you because it has an emotional brain. Now, primates like humans and chimpanzees and great apes, they have an intellectual brain. Ours is, of course, more developed than theirs, but as time goes on and we do more research, we find out maybe not as much as we thought. But these three brains all perceive the world simultaneously with slightly different agendas. And so a lot of the conflicts that we find ourselves in are because the intellectual brain has one agenda and the emotional brain has another agenda, and or the physical brain has another agenda. I'm thinking right now about, like, I've got a career decision to make. Do I go for the money with lots of, status and achievement potential and all of this, or do I live a more simple life and indulge in my hobbies and family relationship stuff, right? That's an example of the emotional system wanting depth of contact and closeness and being there for family, versus the rational intellectual brain that says, but we really need the money and this would be great for my career. And, or we can have conflict where you meet somebody and, your gonads are saying one thing and your intellect is saying another thing, right? That's an often common example that people have to deal with. And that's why we have things like affairs and stuff, even though we all agreed, at one point not to do such things, unless you're in a polyamorous relationship and it's cool. But that's an example of how the different brains process the same situation with different agendas and different values. And, the part that we miss in our culture is we train people to be very rational and think things through. We train people to get, physically fit and skilled at all sorts of sports and activities, but there's very little training for the emotional realm. Like, how many people got any lessons on emotional maturity or relationships, as you're going through school? It may be starting to happen. We're starting to put some programs into schools, but there's a dearth of knowledge and training in these areas. And that's what I'm kind of here to try and fill in. So we'll go back to my, my slides. Basically, you can see that people tend to type into these three classes. You get the nerds, geeks, and brainiacs. You get the artistic and emotional types, and you get the jocks and behavioral types. And if you guys are at a second tier organization, you're probably finding people who are good at 2 or 3 of these areas. That there's enough well balanced in their life that they're starting to work with all 3 brains. But when I was growing up, these types were very set and most people didn't cross them. Now, stress is a big word in our culture. I wish I could just go back and forth easily between your images and these slides, but one of my big insights was that the word stress and the word anxiety were actually code words for our culture to acknowledge that we're emotionally activated, but not actually acknowledge we're emotionally activated. So if you use the word anxiety, you get to talk about your body having all these sensations, but you're not told, yeah, that's an emotional experience you're having. Let's talk about what you're feeling. And it's the same with stress. When we get stressed out, it means we're being triggered emotionally. That something in that stressor, we usually point to it, our boss, our work, our relationship, is causing our stress. And that's all we do, is we talk about it causing our stress. But what I'm saying is that you're actually emotionally activated, and that most of us bring our stress into one of three emotional states. We either get angry under stress, we get fearful under stress, or we get sad/collapse under stress. And once you start deconstructing your stress into emotions, you have a whole new way of looking at it and a whole new way of dealing with your stress. And in fact, stress can become a path to personal growth and transformation, because it gives you opportunities to see your unresolved emotions and work with them. And so that as you work them out of your system, you stop getting stressed by things that used to stress you out. And that's one of the reasons why different people in the same situation have totally different responses to stress. Some people get really stressed out by the boss's personality. Someone else, nothing phases them because they're not being triggered emotionally. So you can decrease your stress and bring clarity to your communications by working through the history that you're bringing to the situation that is not about that situation. Everyone follow that? Right? We're stressed out. It interferes with our ability to communicate. And that's because we're bringing our history to the situation that's not about that situation. The other thing that can happen to get rid of stress is you can change your vision of the situation, but that's a developmental step and much harder to do. And we're not going to talk about that right now. Most of us bring a deep fear of feeling certain ways to our tasks and our relationships. And once you clear these fears and these associations, your stress levels go way down and your communication skills go way up. And that is important enough that I'm going to say it again. Once you clear your fears and your associations, your stress levels go way down and your communication skills go way up. So this brings us to a concept that I call our accidental conditioned history. Our unresolved emotional impressions sensitize and bias us to perceive certain interpersonal dynamics when they are there, when they are not there, or are only hinted at. So this is an important concept that I actually want to make sure everyone gets. How many people can recognize that they sometimes overreact to a situation? Anyone want to put up your hand? Wonderful. Now, why? Yeah, I love that. Why would you be doing that? Well, it's because you have an emotional impression that you took in either in your adulthood, if you've been traumatized, but most often in your childhood. And there's a saying that I've put together that, how many people here have a meditation practice? Cool. In Buddhism, I've been meditating, as you know, for about 45 years. At least it was in my biography. You don't assume you've read it, but and I've really come to appreciate a lot of the teachings of Buddhism. And in Buddhism, there's a concept called the pith teaching. And the pith teaching means that you'll hear the words or the sutra, and you'll go, oh yeah, I get it. And then as you do more work in meditation, you hear the same thing again, and you go, oh, that's what they were talking about. I didn't see that the first time. And then you do some more meditation and work and meditation, and you read the same thing, you go, oh my God, I didn't see that. There's something else in there. And it kind of, a pith teaching points you in the right direction, and it sort of unfolds as you unfold. And so there's a pith teaching that I've put together on emotional impressions that you can write down if you'd like. And what it says is, any intense interpersonal encounter. Notice I didn't put a slide up on this, so you write it down, you're more likely to remember it. Any intense interpersonal encounter that you do not fully experience and express will become part of your sense of self or worldview instead of something that happened to you. So there's a lot in that, but it means that when you were in school and your teacher did something that crushed you out, or your friends did something that crushed you out, and you didn't get to go home and talk about it and cry about it and explore and express your feelings about it, it means it's unresolved. It's not finished with. And you wrapped it around, you wrapped your sense of self around it. You began thinking that you were that attribute, that you were the inadequacy, that you were the insignificance, instead of it just being something that happened to you. And so all of my work as a clinician and as a life coach, most of it is about identifying these core impressions in our accidental conditioned history. Once we've got an impression in there that says, I'm insignificant, or I'm inadequate, or I'm helpless, we tend to perceive the world through that lens. And if someone says something that's got this much emotional charge, and while they're talking to me, they turn away and glance somewhere, and it's a sense of feeling insignificant, well, I'm going to experience it as this big if I'm sensitized to being treated like I'm insignificant and don't matter. Whereas someone who doesn't have that history just sees someone turning away to look at their watch, not that they actually don't care about the person and they're treating them like they're insignificant. Any questions about what we've done so far before we move on to our exercise? How many people are enjoying this? Awesome.
I've got a question.
Lovely. Thank you, Vic. What's the question?
Are there any experiences, or any particular experiences you've discovered a significant number of people in our culture have been impacted by?
Yes. All 9 of my core feelings have huge endorsements by 30% of the population or more. You know, when I've got an online, well, we're going to actually go to it. I've got an online form that people can take at my website. It's hard to do with a computer because it's easy to get intellectual, but you can find the right core feelings. And, you know, I look at the levels of endorsement and they're all quite high, but most people are usually activated in 2 or 3 core feelings in all their different situations. So some people are constantly feeling helpless and insignificant, and other people are constantly feeling worthless and inadequate, and other people are constantly feeling alone and lost. We tend to just keep reliving the same worlds over and over because we got sensitized in that direction. But it's hard to get out of childhood without 2 or 3 impressions like that. Some people will score high on 6 or 7 of them. They usually have diagnostic criteria like they meet diagnostic criteria for mental health disorders, or they're drinking a lot or doing a lot of drugs, you know, because it's hard to live with that kind of sensitivities stuck in our body. So if everyone can go to a browser and type in tinyurl.com/BEF core. And actually, I just realized I could type it out and you could just click on it if you, so it's in the chat. If you click on that, it should just open up the browser and you're going to see a Google form. Now, this is made for what I would call situational activation, but you can use it for what I call a core feeling psychograph, which is what we're going to do today. So is anyone having trouble? Is it popping up for everyone? So if you could fill out that first section, but I would like you to, let me go back. You can bypass reading the first part because I'm talking you through this. If you put your email address in there and your name, you will get a summary PDF sent to you. You will also get loaded onto my Bio-Emotive Framework website email list, so that you'll get a nice series of introduction to this material, that with some podcasts and some other things to listen to if you're interested. If you don't want that, just unsubscribe as soon as you get it. But right now, this is how it's set up, okay? You're going to basically skip the part about what person are you upset about, and where it says briefly describe the situation causing your distress, just put that you're doing a core feeling psychograph. So what we're going to do is take you through an experiential exercise where you're going to get a chance to check into your system in a safe environment when you're not actively being triggered by anything, to see which kinds of words or experiences you're carrying with you that are sensitizing you to react in certain ways to your friends and colleagues and coworkers. And this part about reflect on the situation and how much emotional distress or body activation you experience, you could put that for your general level of emotional distress at work. Okay, just like what's it let's say in your life, just like, do you feel on a scale of 0 to 10, where 10 is like so distressed you're willing, you know, you can't handle it, versus 0, you're just so mellow that nothing stresses you out. So if you just rate yourself on sort of what your general level of distress is, that will be helpful, because if you've got a, you know, a 4 or a 5 or a 6 or an 8, this will tell you where that distress is likely coming from. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is that this is all confidential. It goes into a database. We don't quite have that finished yet, but the email are getting stripped off of it and put in a separate place. But for the most part, nobody cares about this data set but me, and I don't care about the names. But I will be taking the emails off of the data. And, you know, you don't have to worry about confidentiality. Certain IQ metrics are never going to see this. But you guys need to put your email address in for you to get the summary PDF, okay? And if somebody gets this and they just want to be wiped out of the database, just email me and I'll find it and I'll wipe it out, okay? But for the most part, it's interesting to just keep these forms over time as you do this and see how your kind of psychograph profile changes over time. When I work with people, I've had people go from like a profile like this that are high 7s and 8s down to like 3s and 2s. And that means that they're just really mellow in life now, and they're not being triggered by things that they used to get triggered by. So once you've done that and click next, I don't want you to do anything because I'm going to guide you through it, okay? So how many people were jumping ahead? Okay, let's please not do that because this is a different experience. I want you to close your eyes and I want you to tune into your body. And I'm going to just have you say to yourself, I feel alone. And don't care what your rational brain says. You're looking to see how your body and emotional system respond to those words. I feel alone. And say them out loud. Say the words out loud. You can, your mics are off for the most part. So say it out loud so you can actually hear the words being said by your system. I feel alone. And if this brings tears up and crying, that's perfectly fine. If you want to turn your video off, you can do that. If you want to just cry, it's a normal, healthy human thing to go through. It just depends on what you're feeling like relative to your colleagues here. I feel alone. The reason we say it out loud is that it bypasses our repressive mechanisms. If you just think it to yourself, we know that the brain doesn't necessarily get from the intellect to the emotional brain, that those activities can be quite separate. But when you say the words, you hear it in your ear, it goes into your physical brain, gets processed by your emotional brain, and then it has an opportunity, to resonate. So once you've found that, I'd like you to score the number between 0 and 10 and how much activation was there just from saying those words without any situational context, but that your body seems to resonate with. That's why it's called a psychograph. This is about what's stored in your system. And then when you're finished that, I want you to go to the next one and say out loud, I feel inadequate. And just close your eyes. I feel inadequate, and let yourself be open to exploring that possibility. I feel inadequate. I feel inadequate. And then rate that on a 0 to 10 point scale. How much resonance does that cause? If you're tearing up and crying, it's a 9 or a 10. If there's nothing, it's a 0. If there's some moderate stuff that you're relating to, you're getting surprised by the activation, it might be a 5 or a 6. And then we can try, again, close your eyes and tune in. I feel insignificant. I feel insignificant. It's beautiful. I can see people kind of going on an inward journey here and really honoring their internal world. I feel insignificant. And just take a moment to open your eyes and rate that on a 10-point scale. So now close your eyes again. And I want you to just tune into and say the words, I feel lost. I feel lost. It's the opposite of having a vision for your life or to make sense of something. It's just, I feel lost. And just let yourself be surprised and open to what your emotional and physical brains are telling you. I feel lost. You know, does that resonate with you in your life right now? Spiral dynamics, if you know that theory, you're going to be lost between transitions, between phases, between stages. You go into chaos. There's order in each stage, and then there's the chaos of breaking out of that stage and not having your feet on the next plateau, the next stage. So in between there's chaos and the feeling of being lost. You don't know how to make sense of the world between developmental stages. So rate that with a number, and then close your eyes, and we'll tune into I feel helpless. I feel helpless. I feel helpless. That's an awful feeling to have. It's really difficult to live with. Helplessness is just so overwhelming at times. I feel helpless. And then just take a moment to rate what kind of activation you've got there. Now this one can sometimes cut deep. So just kind of be open to feeling whatever's there. Some people are lucky enough that this is never an issue. I feel worthless. I feel worthless. I feel worthless. Just acknowledge and honor your body's responses to those words. I feel worthless. Give that a rating between 0 and 10. Now, in the psychograph, loss is something that when you've had something positive and it goes away, you feel the loss. When you've lived with it for a long time, it's an emptiness. There's a hole in your heart where something should have been. So for this one, you say, I feel an emptiness, because we're looking for those long-term feelings. I feel an emptiness inside. I feel empty. Whatever resonates. I feel empty. I feel an emptiness. I feel empty. Give that a rating. Now this next feeling really comes out of our traditional background, but we all go through that as children when we're learning how to become good people. Good kids, good students, good siblings, good daughter, good son, good spouse, good wife, good husband, good parents. And this is, I feel like a bad person. And you can change that to anything that increases the activation. I feel like a bad daughter. I feel like a bad mother. I feel like a bad son. I feel like a bad father. Just explore if you've got any sense of bad. Now rate that, please, on the 0 to 10 point scale. And we've got one last core feeling to go. That is, I feel hopeless. I feel hopeless. And just let your mind go to whatever situation in your life you feel hopeless about and see what's there for you, if you do have any situations like that. And again, none of this has to make sense. The other thing that I'll let you know is that if you're not used to emotional processing and you're kind of being pushed into it, a common response is to get tired and want to go to sleep. I've actually had people fall asleep on my couch while I was working with them as they finally got in touch with their emotional systems, and just before they were about to tear up, they passed out in the middle of a sentence. And I've had 3 people go through that in my 20 years of working clinically, where they actually passed out in mid-sentence while they're talking to me about their emotions. Often we just get tired and, well, I don't know what's wrong with me, I'm going to go take a nap. If you find that happening, ask yourself if you're emotionally triggered. Or some people, I need to get a drink. I'm going to go for a run. I need to get out of here, right? It usually means that you're emotionally triggered. So rate the feeling for hopeless. You can skip the thing about other feelings, but I would like you to review what you've just done and rate the top 3 words, write them down. Which 3 words are rated highest? And if there's some ties, you can put, 4 or 2, but just write down the 3 words that are rated highest. We're often not used to being emotionally available and emotionally processed. It tends to be repressed. And I've found that depression, my understanding of depression is that it means that you're being constantly emotionally activated and you're not expressing it either with anger or with tears. Those are the 2 ways you can kind of, express stuff. And so because you're activated, but it's not being dissipated through any expression, it's like our system has a shutoff valve, like an emergency fuse, and it trips the switch. And we stop flowing our emotional energy and we get depressed because it's too dangerous to have it running. And so you can't even be happy when the situation to be happy is there because you've shut your emotional system down, right? So depression tends to show up because we're emotionally triggered. And, you see some people who are angry all the time, and it's hard to be around them, but it's either that likely or they're going to get depressed. That's why we have even in our culture this folklore that depression is anger turned inwards, but it tends to be more like anger is one way of dissipating the energy and getting it moving, because tears are often not an option, especially if our associations to tears are it's a sign of weakness or that it's inappropriate. So if we don't have any expression, then we just collapse and turn the system down. That's the depression part. The other option of anxiety, well, that's basically a fear response. When you're constantly activated and you're not expressing the sadness component, usually you're afraid of the feelings that will make you sad. Powerful. When you find the right feeling belief and you say it out loud, so like one of my early feeling beliefs had to do with being alone and insignificant. I'm one of 8 kids, right? And I grew up with traditional parents. And so I was like, you want to cry? I'll give you something to cry about, kind of thing. And so I felt alone and insignificant. And literally my feeling belief was, if I'm going to survive, I have to look after myself. I am alone and insignificant. And if I'm going to survive, I have to look after myself. And that shaped the way I approached relationships. That shaped the way I approached my girlfriends and even my wife. And she had a hell of a time getting any sense of depth of connection with me when we first met, because I was so used to just doing everything on my own. I couldn't count on anybody, right? So it kept a kind of distance between us. Now, over the years, I've done a lot of work, and now we have a very close relationship. But when I would say that feeling belief, I'm alone and insignificant, and if I'm going to survive, I have to look after myself. And I was in that emotional state. I had all these memories of getting up and making my own breakfast, getting up and, getting my own clothes, having to like figure out how to do things at school, even when I was overwhelmed and I didn't know, right? I just got into books and reading. Now, this is just one side of my childhood. I also have fond memories of, having Sunday morning breakfasts and sitting together at a table of 10, and eating and feeling loved. But it was also a very chaotic environment. And there's very little acknowledgement of me as an individual. I talk about feeling like I grew up as part of a wolf pack as opposed to an individual, right? So whatever feelings we have, they're just one narrow representation of that part of us in our past. And it's not the whole picture. And so you have to remember that the important part is to find these little emotional nuggets that are buried, and don't try and rationalize them out of existence until they've had their say. And then once they've fully expressed themselves, then you can integrate it into the bigger picture. Okay? This is about giving time and honoring the part of us that's neglected, which is the emotional system. And then once it's there, you integrate it with what we know intellectually and rationally, and what our physical and biological needs are. Now, all three brains are working together. And if, going back to developmental theory, second tier in my EBIC integral model, which is slightly different than AQUIL, I presented this at the 2010 Conference of Integral Theory. The second tier is characterized by the intellectual brain and the emotional brain starting to work together. The postmodern move of acknowledging feelings honors that brain instead of pushes it down, and it wakes it up. Once it's woken up, it can start working with the intellectual brain to do what it does, which is pattern recognition. Emotions, when I see a facial configuration, I'm making a guess about what that person's feeling based on the pattern of their eyes and their nose and their mouth and their posture. That pattern recognition capacity of the brain can work with concepts to start seeing patterns in knowledge. And that's why the creativity gets so large and ramped up for second tier people. They're constantly seeing patterns and having deep insights about stuff that they've been studying. Once you get those two brains working. Third tier is where all three brains work together, but that's a whole other story. Any other questions about what we're doing? And then we'll go back to this exercise and deepen it one last level. I've said a lot of interesting, controversial things. So anyone have any questions or clarifications?
I ask a quick question. It's not directly related to the exercise, but you mentioned that a lot of issues are coming from childhood traumas or childhood issues.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering, I've listened quite a bit and read a few things from Gabor Mate, which is a Vancouver-based doctor.
Yeah.
I'm familiar with his work, and is that something that you feel is very kind of complementary to what you're doing, or this is the same thing that you do?
Very complementary. One of the things about the Bio-Emotive framework is that it's a detailed understanding of the emotional system and how it works. And you can add it to any other therapy and get to do that therapy more effectively. So if Gabor Mate knew this framework, he would be able to conceptualize the childhood traumas and issues or addictions with a more articulated, speech and understanding. We're getting close to it with some of the attachment styles. People are starting to talk about, secure and insecure and anxious attachment. Well, those are just impressions in the emotional system that are being categorized into 3 outcomes. But if you look deeply into those attachment styles, you're going to see that they're feeling alone or insignificant or worthless. This is just more conceptual resolution to these things. So it's very compatible, complementary system to any other systems that are out there. The big difference where it's a little bit incompatible with cognitive behavior therapy, and that's just because it's cognitive behavior founded itself on an untested, unresearched assumption, which is when Beck and Ellis, Beck made the assumption that that background voice that was going on in his clients that they were never talking about was the thought process that he needed to pay attention to. And that's where he said, well, it's our thinking process that we have to change. My experience is that our unresolved emotions and feelings cause us to think certain things. So if I have feelings of insignificance, I'm going to be constantly thinking about ways that I'm being insignificant or could be insignificant, or ways that I could be really significant and valued, by doing certain things. We tend to think about the things that are emotionally important to us. A lot of people have put up their hand when I said, how many people are meditating? This is also another good exercise. I did this experiment with the group that I was running with Integral when we were doing meditation. And I had people write down their mind chatter, and everybody handed in like 10 pieces of mind chatter that was typical in a meditation sit. And we went through and put them on a grid with the 9 core feelings. And then as a group, anonymously, we said, if you were thinking this thought, what feeling might you be having to make you think this way? And it was pretty unanimous that everybody's 10 pieces of mind chatter had like 2 or 3, usually 2, feelings behind them, that they're all reflections of inadequacy, or all reflections of helplessness, or all reflections of worthlessness. But the opposite, where you're thinking about ways to be valued and dreaming about things that you could do to feel significant. So they show up in both sides. But each person's mind chatter was being generated by 1 or 2 unresolved feelings. And so that's something I actually recommend for anyone who's having trouble with mind chatter, is stop, either write it down or just stop and ask yourself, what would I be feeling that would make me think this way? And you've got that handout with the 9 core feelings. And you'll find that most of your mind chatter goes into that. And so once you find it, you can literally say to yourself, oh, I feel insignificant. Whew. I feel insignificant. And then, whatever is being triggered will come to mind, and you can cry about it, express the insignificance, decide what you can do about it if you need to. And then when you go back to sit, the mind chatter will be gone. It almost always just goes away. And if it does, you can just say, oh, there's my friend insignificance again. Mark it and go back to your attention. But that's eventually what we want to have happen, is that we'll start being much more objective. And, it's ironic to say, but we take our feelings far too personally. We do. We take our feelings far too personally. And once we can just name our feelings and express them and they're gone, they're not about us. They're about things that happened to us. So just to finish this exercise, I'm going to do one last little piece here. I'm going to choose, go back to the part where you said, I feel alone. Just scroll back up to I feel alone. And I'm going to just give you this probably one example where unpacking the word alone may actually change your relationship to it. This is about the cultural alexithymia. The word, for example, inadequate, it's a fairly conceptual word. There's not an easy emotional resonance to it until your emotional system has learned that that's the word for this feeling. But that takes some time. So I'm going to read you a bit of an outline of alone, and I want you to close your eyes now and say, I feel alone. And then I'm going to read a definition out, and I want you to see if it changes how you feel about that word. Alone, having no sense of connection or commonality with anyone around you. One can be in close physical proximity to people, even engaging in small talk at a crowded party or social gathering, and still feel very alone in the world. Having no sense of connection or commonality with anyone around you. One can be in close physical proximity to people, even engaging in small talk at a crowded party or social gathering, and still feel very alone in the world. Watching all the people huddled together in apparently deep, meaningful conversations, laughing and engaged with each other, made me feel very alone in the world as I shuffled from one group to another, looking for some sense of connection. So that's just an example of trying to teach the emotional system through examples and situations what that word means. And I just like, and this is like, by me talking about it and giving an example, the emotional brain is being woken up. And it goes, oh, that's what that word means. I relate to that. And if you find yourself resonating, it's like, okay, I feel alone. And it's like your emotional brain is getting it at a deeper level. And that's what we want ultimately, is for our emotional brain to know these core feelings so that it can express itself with full force as it needs to. And so if you just want to complete this form, you can do that after you leave here. And it'll send you a summary of this to you. This has been a wonderful time. I hope you guys have benefited from it, and I hope you can see that, you know, your stress and your ability to communicate is very much affected by the history you bring to those situations, right? And I've gone to a very core level here. Like, this is not going to solve your communication problems, but it's going to give you a new way of looking at them, at stress and communication, where you can start saying, okay, if I'm reacting to this person, what is it triggering in me that maybe has nothing to do with them? And as you do this work and get clearer and cleaner, right, you just show up more fully, more confidently, and less scattered by your own internal states. It's easier to be rational because you're not countering the irrational emotional processes that want and are looking for some time and space in your life. Okay, so any final thoughts or words or anything that you would like to share before we end here?
Yeah, maybe something that came up for me. I've been interested in this idea of you know, pathology that's associated with power. And as you were describing this, and obviously a lot of what's been unfolding lately, you know, is directly related to it. And when I read Plato some time ago. In Plato's Republic, he talked about how all power, has this corruptibility to it, and he was proposing ways to sort of get around that, and that's always stuck with me. But my question is around is pathology associated with, from people that have unprocessed emotions? Do you feel like that is a root cause of different pathology? And also maybe another aspect, any observations of pathology in leadership as well, and associated with power and hierarchy? I think one of the things that I've seen over the years is how in power situations, there's these emergent things that can get out of hand. And one of the hopes is that in kind of us co-regulating each other and having a system of principles ordered in accordance to second tier, although everybody's going to be differently, and all the tiers are integrated, that we can transcend some of these pathologies. So love to hear sort of two parts of that question, but love to get your thoughts on that.
Well, could you say a bit more on what you mean by pathology?
Like, pathology as in behaviors that emerge. Like, look at the policing situations that we've seen, or look at leaders in political power that, will bring their conditioning, their childhood trauma, and enact it in their environments, right? Over the years, I've seen, we interview people that, we think fit, but then you can see behaviors that are more, say, in accordance to red, as an example, which can happen at times. We can all be functioning from a red level, but that's generally not a good place to be functioning from. So.
Yeah, it's a very loaded, big question that you're asking. And I'll say that a lot of the issues that we see, like with the police and people in power, are developmental. Narcissism is a developmental issue. Racism is a developmental issue. And having said that, though, we tend to regress down to lower developmental states because of emotional traumas. So behind every developmentally stunted racist, there's usually a trauma that's keeping them there, unable to progress forward. My EBIC integral model is a little different from standard spiral dynamics in that I see this as our three brains having two different states of processing the world. And when the emotional brain gets activated, which is where our traumas are, most usually, we're either going to be in a power dominance, power dominance, like impulsive, angry kind of state, or we're going to go to the communal mode of the emotional brain, which is a traditional rules and roles defer to authority kind of situation. And you can hear it in people's language when they get triggered, whether they get angry or fearful, which is the power dominance thing, or whether they start deferring to authority and saying what the right thing is to do, right? And so we tend to jump to the brain that's being triggered in that situation and then play out the developmental stage that it's in. And if you find yourself jumping to those lower stages, it's because you've got unresolved trauma that's activating that brain and causing it to take over at that stage. That's a lot to cover in one, soundbite, but I've been thinking about this stuff for a long time. So I know we're over time, and I want to honor that. And I just want to say it's been wonderful to spend some time with you. I hope this isn't the first or the last time that we meet. I would love to keep working with an organization that's thinking along these lines and see if I can help out in what you guys are doing. And I really am impressed by the fact that you guys as a collective are embracing these high-level values, because we need that in our society. So thank you so much for having me be part of your little community. And thank you, Tracy, for thinking of me and making sure that this happened. And I look forward to maybe hearing from you if you want to know more. There's my website, and I've got some nice videos and self-paced courses and group programs that I offer with my daughter, actually, to help bring this healthy emotional processing to the world. So thank you, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your retreat seminar work.
Thanks for being here, Doug.